Hello, welcome to Power BI Cloud series from DoSQLBI.com. In the earlier sessions, we had an overview of Power BI on cloud. We went over natural query languages. In this session, we will go over data management gateways. And then in the following, we'll have integration with big data and machine learning. Data sources layout in Power BI. Power BI facilitates publishing queries and data sources to data catalog. This data catalog is hosted in Power BI Cloud Service. And we use Power Query for Excel to create and manage and use those queries that are added to data catalog. Another option that Power BI provides is to add the data sources to data management gateways. This is cloud hosted service which is designed to make an secure way of consuming the on-premises data sources. For that, we install and set up data management gateway client on-premises, and then all the security credentials are stored and protected with this data management gateway client tool, which is hosted within the premises. That facilitates accessing a large variety of data sources. Now there is also the way that we could consume query data sources in the data catalog through data sources in data management gateways, and there is the possibility of consuming the data sources that are added to data management gateway through Power Query. We will see shortly all these in a demo. We'll see the first demo where we set up the data management gateway. I have a setup where I have two machines. One is the domain controller where data management gateway should not be installed and is not supported. I have a second machine that is not a domain controller, which is the same domain. That's where we will be installing and setting up the data management gateway. This setting up of the data management gateway has to be performed on premises. Let me switch to the client machine. So on this client machine, I'm logging into my Office 365 account. After I log in, I'll go to under admin, go to Power BI. In Power BI Admin Center, I go to gateways, and as you see, I don't have any gateway instance defined as of now. So I can go and create the first one. I can name it as my gateway 1, add a description, gateway to on premises, enable cloud credential store to achieve business continuity for the gateway. This is in case where we want to restore gateway on a different machine on premises. This would be used for that purpose, so we'll not go for that at this moment. Asks me to create an instance. Gateways support multi-instance gateway, so I will leave it with the default name as instance 1 and then click on create. Now what I see is the gateway has been created successfully. I need to download and install the data gateway management client. If I click on the download button, I'll be taken to download the bits. So here is where I can download the data management gateway client. It's available in 32-bit and 64-bit versions. So I'll say 64-bit version. I'll save this on my desktop. Once the download is complete, I can go and run this setup to install data management gateway. I'm accepting the agreement, clicking next, and installing the data management gateway client, which is hosted on some machine on premises. What this is going to do is create a data management gateway service on this machine, and then we will have to go through the step of registration. So once the data management gateway client tool is completed installation, we click this finish. So what it has done is it has started the configuration manager to register that data management gateway client on this host machine which is on premises. Now if I go back to my BI admin portal, first step was to download this data management client. and install it, and then it gives me step second and a gateway key which I need to register it on the client. So I can directly copy this, go to the client, paste it here, you can see the key and say register. It provides two endpoints, one of which is plain HTTP and another is HTTPS. For our demo purpose, we will go with the default one. Click next and click finish. At this point now, we see the status of the service that it installed on this machine, Data Management Gateway client service. It is started. It started, it is connecting to the cloud service of Data Management Gateway, and we should be seeing the status shortly. We can now we see connected to Data Management Gateway cloud service. We can go to the service, we can go to our portal, click finish, and it should shortly update the status here on the portal, showing that the service is running successfully. Service and the client, it's able to communicate with the client now. So in this step, what we have done is we have set up the Data Management Gateway on premises on the machine which is Windows 8.1 machine that's running on premises, and so that part of the demo is complete. We also get this configuration manager on the client where we could see what is the data gateway name, what is the instance name, what is the status of the service, whether it is able to communicate back to the Data Management Gateway cloud service. So let's switch back to our presentation. Our next demo is to add a data source to a data gateway. What we'll do for that is we will add one data source, which is the list of persons in the on-premises SQL. Let's switch back to our demo. We will go to Power BI Admin Center, go to data sources. Now here is where we can add now data sources. If I click on add, I have SQL Server, Oracle, SharePoint Online Document Library, and Power Query available to be that I can add as a data source. In this example, we'll go for SQL Server. Now, what it asks me is the data source usage. Enable cloud access. I can make it searchable in Power Query. I can also enable it for OData feed. So we can just start with a simple one. Go next. Add, say, my person list on-prem SQL. Add some description, list of persons from on-premises SQL. Then I need to define which gateway I want to add this data source to. So I have only one, which is my gateway 1. So I select that. I have to define what is data source type. It's SQL, and I can either define a connection string or connection properties. So I'll go through connection properties, say SQL Server native client. I have to give the server name, which is w2k12.contoso.com. Then I give a database name, which is dev test. As soon I come out of that, it will ask me to provide the credentials. Now I click on this. It will run click once application for data source settings. Now it was able to communicate. It gives me that what type of credentials they are they database or Windows. So I'll say SQL credentials. I give the username, which is SQL login, and I give its password. I don't want to encrypt that, and I say privacy level is organizational. So which is basically this Power BI is groups users as an organizational user. That's how I initially logged into this. I want to restrict this data source utilization to the members of the organization. Now let's do a quick test. The test was successful. I say okay. It's saving these credentials. I say next, and I can click finish. What we just did is we added a data source by going to the portal, and on the portal it provides us various data sources that we could add. We added SQL, and data management gateway is now updated with this data source, and it made a test connection that whether that data source is accessible to the data management gateway client. And these credentials that we just entered are stored on premises on the machine that is hosting data management gateway client. That's something important to remember. We are not letting our on-prem data source credentials to be taken out from on-premises security boundaries. Now let's switch back to our presentation. As of now, we added the data source where our list of persons is available, but we did not define, we did not mention anywhere what do we want out of that data source. Now there are various ways we could do that. We could add a query in our Power Pivot model that will refer this data source and define in the query what we want out of that particular data source from that database. Or the other way is, as an OData feed, we can define that what do we need out of that data source. Let's switch back to our demo. So coming back to the demo, we click on this data source. I can see the properties. It says me status is ready, what is the gateway, and cloud access is enabled, but OData feed is not enabled. So what we are going to do is to go and edit this data source, and in the usage we'll say it should be, we should enable the OData feed. So in that case, when we go to data settings, it should be able to query what are the data sources that we could publish as OData feed. Now it found under tables there are 6 tables, there are 3 tables. So I want to take this person data. That's what I want to make available as OData feed. So what we are going to do is now save this. As I said, this is just one way we could expose the data from that data source. If we want to do that as an OData feed, we could have otherwise referred that data source in the Power Pivot model. We could have written the SQL query, and that query could, and then the model with the query could have been published on the Power BI site, and that at the time of refreshing could have utilized this data source. So what we did now so far is we published it and we added as a list of persons, basically the person table, as an OData feed. Now coming back to the properties, we see OData feed is enabled and it is giving that URL. It also provides a way to test the connection. We could do that here. So testing is successful, just to make sure everything is fine. Let's come back to our presentation. Now the next thing is utilizing a gateway data source via Power Query. So this is that we added data source to the data management gateway, but we want to utilize that by using a Power Query for Excel. Now a data source which is in the data management gateway by default is not browsable in the Power Query. What we could do is we can explicitly enable that. Let's switch back to the demo. We again come here, we edit our data source, we say that it is searchable in Power Query. So we finished setting up of the data management gateway. We added a data source to that gateway. We enabled that data source to be accessible through Excel Power Query. Next, what we'll do is we'll search for data using Power Query and see what are the data sources that it's able to pull data from. So what I'm going to do is I am now on my machine, which is also domain controller, just to give a feeling that from any machine in the corporate I can go and start Excel Power Query and start searching for data. So let me start Excel. So in Excel, I go to Power Query and I'm already signed in. So let's see what I'm signed in as. So I'm signed in as, at the moment, with an administrator account. Let me switch an account to my organizational account, where this data source has been created and published. I'm entering my password and signing in. Now I'm in Excel, and in Excel I'm logged in into my organizational account. So in Power Query we go to search online. Now I type something that I want to see. So I simply said list. What it found is, it found there are two data sources available from the organizational data source, and there are 446 from the public data source. What I'm interested is in the organizational data source that we just made, that we just published as a source that could be that is searchable from Power Query. Now I can see a quick sample of this data. I can say I want to load this data. I may want to load it only to the table or to the data model as well, Power Pivot data model. I can add it to the existing sheet. Let's see what shows up. So I started Excel. I logged into Power Query, and I'm pulling back this data that is available there. So it's asking me for credentials. I will provide my organizational credentials and save it. Now what I did is, if you see, I did not provide the actual data source login credentials. What I rather provided is my organizational account, because the data source with the data management gateway, it was made available to all. The privacy level was set as organizational, which means all the authenticated organizational members should have access to this Power Query. And when it made this connection, it the data was pulled from the data source, and credentials were supplied from the data management gateway client that is hosted on our machine on one of the machine in on premises network. Again, another point to mention here is, the way this data was populated here is not that the on-premises data was first sent to the cloud, and then from cloud it was again downloaded to this Excel. The authentication, the query was first made that went through data management gateway cloud service, and then there was a communication between the cloud service and the client, and then it found that this data is after the authentication was passed as an organizational user, it redirected the data. The data was directly then served from on-premises source to the on-premises client that was asking, and in this case that is Excel. Let's switch back to the presentation. So what we saw is, we searched for data that was made available to Power Query, the corporate data that was published for the organizational users. Next, what we will see is, we will be adding new queries to the data catalog. In that, we'll do two things. We will add a corporate data source query that is utilizing the corporate data source to the data catalog, and in this case we will use a salesperson's data. And then subsequent to that, we will also add a query to the data catalog which is from a public data source, which is a list of countries by GDP. Let me switch to the Excel. So I'm going back to Power Query and saying we want a data from a SQL. I'm adding the name of the SQL, which is w2k12.contoso.com, and the database is devtest. I can also type the SQL statement, select asterisk from dbo.salesperson, and now I say okay. I got the data. I'm naming it as Power query salesperson. So what I can say is, again, I can say close and load to. I will say new worksheet, and I'll also add to the data model and say load. At this point, what it did was it added one query, and then I can publish this query to the data catalog. So I say send to the data catalog, but I can do that only when I would have already logged in to my organizational Office 365 Power BI account. So I say right click, send to data catalog. It's asking me if I want to give any description. This is a list of salesperson. Upload first few rows for preview, that's fine. So we added this query to Power Query in the data catalog that is part of the Power BI cloud service. And this was the one where we found the data source from. This was from the data management gateway made available to Power Query. Now we want to add one more data, which was one more query, which is coming back to this. And now I run a query which is GDP by country name, and I search. So we searched for list of countries by GDP. We can take this one and say load to. I can say new worksheet, add to data model. Now this is a public data source from Wikipedia, and it pulled the list of countries and their GDP for the year 2012 up to 2012. Now this is one more query. What I can do is, again, I can publish this to the data catalog. When I do that, it asks me to define the properties. I can say, I can remove this 1990 to 12, say list by World Bank, and say list of countries by GDP. Here's a Wikipedia data source, and I am adding this another query to my data catalog. Now what I could do is I can save this. I can save this directly into the SharePoint site, name it as demos, saved, and I can, once the save is complete, I can close this file. What I want to quickly show is, now that I close that file, I can go to new file, say new, and go to Power Query. I'm still logged into my organizational account, and I can say, are there any workbook queries? So there aren't any. Now I can go to my data catalog queries. What it will do at this point is, it went to Power BI data catalog that's hosted in the cloud service, and it pulled all the queries that I have saved there. The most two recent ones was this list of countries by GDP and Power Query salesperson. If I want, imagine this is any other user who has who is now the organizational member, authenticated user, and then he can come and just simply use this data that has been published for the organizational users. So I got that data. Okay, so at this point now let's switch back to our presentation. So what we saw so far is, we set up a data management gateways, we added a data source to that gateway, we utilized that data source via Power Query after enabling it, making it searchable for Power Query. We search it for data. We then utilized that query that was made searchable to Power Query. We added two more data queries to a data catalog. One was corporate data source, a list of salespersons, and then one query that related to the public data source, list of countries by GDP. Next, we'll see adding Power Query data source to gateway data source. What we had seen earlier is we created a data source in data management gateway and made it available to Power Query. Now we are going to do the reverse, that the Power Query that we added, we want to make it available to data management gateway. Let's switch back to the demo. Let's open the file that we just saved, which was this demos, which we saved on SharePoint. And in this, we had created this Power Query salesperson, that's this data, and our goal is to add this to the data management gateway. So what we do for that purpose is we go to data, we go to connections, and in the connections we see this Power Query salesperson's connection there, and here we go to properties, definitions, and we copy this connection string here, copy, and now we can go to our Office 365 Power BI account, log into that. Once we log into Office 365 account, and we can go to Power BI admin center under data sources and add a Power Query as a data source. When we do that, it asks us for the connection string that we just copied from the Excel connection strings. We are pasting that here, and now we say next. So we can specify what name we want to give it. So we can say GDP by country names by GDP. We want to define the gateway, and it's asking us for the credentials. Let's see, because the public data source, the anonymous option should work as well. So we already have an anonymous. Okay, we could have gone to other Windows basic marketplace. So this one anonymous should be good enough. We can test this connection. Testing is successful. We may want testing is successful. We say okay. Now in this example, okay, we need to save it as well. Okay, so we can't leave the space in the data source name. So let's save it now. It got saved. So what do we have now is we have Power Query connection. So that's also successful. We say next, next, and say save. Now in this case, this GDP by country is a data source that we had added to the Power Query data sources, and then we subsequently added that to data management gateway. This one person list, which we added as a data management gateway data source, we made it searchable to Power Query, and we just saw a moment back how we were able to search using Power Query and find those corporate data sources as well and consume that data source. Let's switch back to our presentation. Now the last thing to see is how do we refresh the data once we have this data management gateway set up. Let's do with the file that we just published into our Power BI site. Let's switch back to the Power BI site. So we go to sites in the team site under Power BI. We just added this file as demos. We find it here. The first thing to do is to enable this. workbook. It reconfirms the enabling of the workbook, so we enable that. It takes a moment. Now that it's enabled, can close it. Now we have the options we had earlier seen about the Q&A and the featured reports. Now we go to schedule data refresh. It lists down all the first of all we need to switch it on, data refresh. Now once we do that, it shows us all the connections that are available for refresh. So this workbook, the connections that are used in the Power Pivot model are one which is Power Query salesperson. The other one is list by the World Bank GDP, and third is this person. We can do all of them, we can do one of them. Let's do just one. It gives us way to define what the schedule should be. We can define the time, and we can also define the time zone, how are we setting up the time. So let's say it's US and Canada UTC time zone. I set up daily 3 a.m. in the morning, and when who should receive the notification. So I'll say nasir.mirza@dosequelbi.com. I can save this setting and then it will trigger it at the scheduled time, or I can say save but trigger it manually right now. So I click save and refresh report. I can go to the history here or click this status, which takes me to the history. It just shows that it has added the on-demand data refresh to the queue, and we'll wait to see its results. Just to mention, this Power Pivot data model is having one of the data sources which is an on-premises data source, and that it is going to refresh from using the data management gateway service, which will connect to the data management gateway client, which is itself hosted on premises, and the credentials that are required to access that data source are also saved on that on premises on the data management gateway client. So it refreshed that data source successfully. Let's switch back to our demo presentation. We saw all the demo steps. To sum it up quickly, we saw setting up of a data management gateway, adding a data source to the gateway. In our case, we added on-premises SQL data source, utilizing that data source of the management gateway through Power Query and making it searchable to the Power Query. And then we added 2 new queries to the data catalog. One was based on the corporate data source, another was the public data source. Then we also saw how we can add Power Query data source to the data management gateway, and then scheduling the data refresh to the Power Pivot model. Some data source details in Power BI. One of the data sources is Power Query, where we store data sources and queries in a data catalog. That source is available to be consumed using Excel that we saw during our demo, and we could also consume that through data management gateway by adding that data source as a data source in data management gateway. Again, we need to remember that all the data sources that Power Query supports at present, all of them are not yet supported to be added as a data source in data management gateway. And if we are using Power Query data source, the credentials are stored in the Power Query for Excel. The other data source with Power BI is Data Management Gateway, which is primarily focused on making access to on-premises data source secure, where the credentials are stored on premises gateway client, and this source is available to Power Query when it's enabled as searchable, and we could also have Power Pivot data models that are referring those data sources to be refreshed. Third is which has been there for for a long time, the embedded data sources in the Excel workbooks, where the credentials are also stored in the workbook itself. Data source considerations. The data source name or the IP address that has been used in the data model should have a matching data source in the data management gateway for a successful refresh. The data source that we want to refresh using data management gateway, that source should be accessible from the machine on which data management gateway client is hosted on the on-premises network. In Power BI, scheduled data refresh works for Power Pivot data model, not for tables in Excel. And as we spoke a moment back, Power Query supports a large variety of data sources. When we add Power Query as a data management gateway data source, some of them are not yet supported. So in summary, we have seen data refresh has been there, available to SharePoint and SharePoint Online for a long time. We saw data management portal, how we can store queries and data sources, both cloud and corporate, manage Power Queries using Excel, and then through management gateways, which is to get a secure access to on-premises data sources. We saw how we set up and configure that. We saw adding the data sources and exposing those data sources or data feed to Power Query, and then adding the Power Query data sources to data management gateways. This was the data management gateway presentation in our Power BI on cloud. In the subsequent presentations, we'll go over its integration, Power BI integration with big data and machine learning. I'm Nasser Ali Mirza at DoSQLBI.com. Thank you.